Last week, the Biden administration announced it would tap former President Trump appointee Elliott Abrams to join the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy. He was one of 8 Republicans handpicked to serve on the Bipartisan Commission.
Some see the decision as controversial because Elliott was famously convicted for lying to Congress over the Iran-Contra affair. Moreover, he is associated with facilitating and covering up human rights violations in Latin America when he worked for the Reagan administration. Here to discuss the details of Biden's latest appointment is Branko Marcetic, a staff writer for Jacobin and the author of Yesterday's Man, The Case Against Joe Biden. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So what should our viewers know about this figure, Elliott Abrams?
I mean, I don't like to throw the word evil around, but I mean, Elliott Abrams really is one of the most just unambiguously vile, you might say evil people that has worked in Washington. I mean, this is a guy who his entire job when he was in the Reagan administration was to cover up human rights abuses by the Contras and military forces of these right-wing governments in Central America that the Reagan administration was supporting, and to make sure that military aid was going to them in order to not only to roll back left-wing influence in the region, but in the process, they were carrying out pretty sickening human rights violations that people can go look them up if they wanted to see the details. It's not really worth going into here. I mean, aside from that, and aside from subsequently lying to Congress about it, he's also been a guy who's been involved in coup attempts in other countries. Venezuela, famously in 2002, kind of gave the nod to that attempt against Hugo Chavez. Again, was involved years later under the Trump administration to try and foment regime change against Maduro this time, Nicolas Maduro, Chavez's successor. He was involved reportedly in an attempt within the Bush administration to foment a civil war in the Palestinian territories after the 2006 elections did not go the way that the Bush administration went and put Hamas in power in Gaza. And, he's a guy who has very vocally supported regime change efforts that didn't happen, but could still be on the cards. I mean, he was saying that basically the U.S. should, if some of the kind of more covert stuff didn't work, should just basically invade Nicaragua or do a blockade to try and topple its government. He was saying the same thing about Iran as well. That if Iran gets close to developing a nuclear weapon, the U.S. should just bomb it. So, really every single part of his record, which I've only given you a tiny sliver of here, really makes a complete mockery of all the rhetoric that the Biden administration has been using on the world stage over the past, year, if not the entire term.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen kind of a left-wing pushback against some of Joe Biden's appointments and other kind of political choices over the last few years. And usually there's a chorus of defenders, people who are close to the administration, insiders, establishment actors, who defend Joe Biden's choices. This time, there seems to be a more unanimous pushback from folks who, even people who are very fond of Joe Biden and the job that he's been doing as president, are kind of scratching their heads and asking why he's made this particular choice. And I want to ask you what you make of this decision. Do you think Joe Biden underestimated the level of pushback, objection he would get around this appointment? Or do you think that this reflects an ideological commitment from Joe Biden that people should be really concerned about?
I mean, number one, my initial reaction, and still is, I don't really know what the calculus here, the political calculus is. There's no real gain to this. It's a highly publicity triggering appointment because Elliott Abrams is so on and has such a terrible record and was also part of the Trump administration, but he's also being put in a role that, at least from what's been said, it's not a particularly, anyone could have taken this role. There dozens, if not hundreds of people in Washington that would be happy to kind of basically shape U.S. propaganda efforts overseas for the sake of undermining governments that are unfriendly to the United States, which is what the U.S. Public Commission on public diplomacy is. It's about it's about propaganda and kind of public relations messaging for U.S. interests on the world stage. So I'm not really sure what they gain from it, aside from this really terrible news cycle. But I mean, to what you were saying right there, I mean, I think it does point to a very uncomfortable fact about the Biden administration. I mean, we were told that this was going to be a break from Trump, that it was going to kind of confirm that the Trump administration was an aberration, that it had nothing to do with American political tradition, and that, the Democrats were going to take U.S. foreign policy and government into a more kind of competent, human rights and democracy focused direction. And I mean, the truth is that there's actually a fairly worrying influence of neoconservatives in the Biden administration. And I don't just mean people who are kind of liberal interventionists, such as Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken, but outright neocons, people like Victoria Nuland, who basically is running Ukraine policy under Biden, as she was to a lesser extent under Obama. And I think the lack of attention to the neocon influence in the Biden administration is kind of one of these underreported stories, or these stories that don't really get that much attention, even though, we were all appalled at the foreign policy of Trump and then George Bush before him.
Does this show that liberals, Democrats, the mainstream, they are keen to rehabilitate anyone as long as that person had kind of like a personal dislike of Donald Trump? I'm seeing that he was quoted as saying that he thought, Elliott Abrams, even though he served under Trump, he thought Trump was not fit to be president, and continued to think that, and especially thought that after January 6th, that kind of thing, where someone's, substantive foreign policy positions and agenda can be totally papered over if, they find Trump as icky as establishment figures in Democratic circles do.
I mean, that's definitely a phenomenon that's been a thing since Trump got elected. I don't really see it so much here. I mean, actually, to be honest, I haven't seen any administration defense or explanation of this so far. I mean, it's been reported and it's made a lot of news, and a lot of people have been very angry about it. But I haven't seen anyone, and maybe I just haven't seen it, but I haven't seen anyone actually saying, well, this is why Elliott Abrams deserves to be in here. And I think a big part of the reason for that is because his appointment is really indefensible, not just on moral grounds, but even just on political grounds. I would love to see, if there was a White House pool reporter, or one of the reporters that ask questions of the State Department on a regular basis. I'd love if they were able to put the question of what exactly is going on with this decision, and why on earth would they pick someone with a record this horrendous to be anywhere near U.S. foreign policy, even if this is just running propaganda operations overseas. Someone like this should not be, as I put it in the piece, should not even be washing dishes in the White House.
Yeah, I mean, it does speak to a kind of impunity. I said earlier that there's been left pushback to any number of Biden appointments in the past, whether it's just the Neera Tanden back and forth that was a lot about her substantive politics, but also her interpersonal politics and her attitude toward the left, whether it's appointing a former Raytheon executive as Secretary of Defense. I mean, there have been these what are you doing moments from the broader liberal Democratic Party and left community about what Joe Biden does. But it does seem like the vote blue no matter who ethos quickly makes it so that no substantive criticism should stick. So just as we wrap here, I want to ask you, as someone who's expert on these matters, I wonder if you've reflected on the other candidates in the primary fields of both parties and made any kind of decisions, analysis about which of them seem to offer a real departure from the neocon core of both establishment parties.
I mean, the Democratic field is pretty depressing. I mean, there's many criticisms one can and I certainly have made of the Biden administration foreign policy. RFK says a lot of the good things that sound kind of reasonable in foreign policy. But, unfortunately, that comes with a poison pill of all these other kind of positions that he takes, not just on vaccines, but, I'm not really particularly inspired by his very tepid kind of support for Medicare for all that you guys kind of extracted from him, and a whole host of other domestic policy issues. Marianne Williamson, has impressed me on domestic policy, but I think in terms of foreign policy, there's not that much daylight between what Biden is doing and what she's saying, at least from what I've seen so far. I wish there was more of an emphasis on, sure, you can support military aid to Ukraine, but the real emphasis that has to be put is on peace efforts. So far, no one really is impressing me too much. But I think, that points to the need to not just kind of wait for a candidate or a politician to say and do the things that we hope that they would, but to actually exert some sort of pressure, whether it's on these primary challenges or on the Biden administration itself, to take a more reasonable, more humane approach to foreign policy.
Branko Marcetic, thank you so much for joining us.
Cheers. Thanks.